Thank you. Yes, I decided I'm going to go as Jekyll and Hyde as I possibly could for this presentation. So first off, thank you everybody for being here. You can all hear me? All right, perfect. It is 2 a.m. here, so it seems to me like probably much greater a sacrifice than it probably seems for all of you. But again, thank you all for joining me. Again, my paper is entitled Becoming Mrs. Hyde, Adaptation and Female Violence in Evan Placey's Jekyll and Hyde. Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde should always have been a play. A bold statement, I know, but hear me out. The transformation from Jekyll to Hyde and back again is an extraordinary visual image. Take, for instance, the description by Dr. Lanyon of Hyde's transition back to Jekyll near the end of the novella. He'd put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with open mouth. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black, and the features seemed to melt and alter. For anybody familiar with screenplays or the intricate stage directions popular in the late 19th century, this sounds extraordinarily like a scene description. And, in fact, the theatrical potential of Stevenson's work was almost immediately recognized, because within a year of the book's 1886 publication, Richard Mansfield was starring as Jekyll and Hyde in a New York stage production, which then opened in London in 1888, only weeks before Jack the Ripper's killing spree began. Since then, and especially in recent decades, there have been numerous stage adaptations of Stevenson's work, several of which I touch on in the larger article-length version of this essay, which I'm hoping that Limina will pick up. This presentation, however, focuses specifically on Jekyll and Hyde, a 2017 adaptation by Canadian-born, London-based playwright Evan Placey, recontextualized for the Me Too movement. Instead of the male Jekyll and Hyde, Placey has a female protagonist, and he breaks down temporal boundaries by introducing a contemporary woman named Florence Monroe. However, I argue that Placey's play most starkly diverges from Stevenson's precedent by replacing Stevenson's id-driven male Hyde with female protagonists, specifically who use violence largely to protect others from institutional violence. Because of its cultural cachet, most people will be familiar with at least the gist of Stevenson's novella, but as a brief refresher, the storyline follows Dr. Henry Jekyll, a London scientist who creates a formula to separate the good and evil halves of the human personality. His goal is to enjoy the unspecified pleasures he has always secretly indulged or desired to indulge without endangering his social standing. Jekyll's formula splits him between the mild-mannered and respectable middle-class Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Mr. Edward Hyde, a vicious, selfish, lower-class embodiment of evil. Initially, Jekyll is in full control over when he transforms into Hyde, but as the story goes on, Hyde becomes stronger and Jekyll eventually loses his ability to contain his evil half, a problem compounded when he runs out of the chemical used to make the formula and cannot replace it. Unable to control the transformations, Jekyll finally poisons himself rather than hang for Hyde's crimes. Placey's play takes quite a different approach to the story. In his version, Henry Jekyll is dead, poisoned by his unsuccessful formula, and his widow Harriet is denied the support of the Royal Society of Scientists to carry on his work. However, she finishes her late husband's experiment anyway, and transforms into Flossie Hyde, who frequents taverns, drinks liquor, hangs around with gay men, has sex with whom she pleases, and eventually murders a police officer. Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins with Florence Monroe, a 21st century woman arrested for the death of the officer that we'd just seen Hyde murder. This act break marks a temporal shift to modern times, with Monroe accused by the police of masterminding Fembot, a violent group of feminist terrorists whose actions she coordinates and orders through blog posts. After originally posting a blog about violent misogynist rhetoric from her boy at her school, Monroe had been subjected to a troll storm, a massed campaign of cyber harassment typically involving threats of murder, sexual violence, and so on, and typically directed against women or minorities who challenged systems of social inequality. The police did nothing to help or protect her. Monroe initially denies her involvement with Fembot until it's too late for the police to stop a planned attack coordinated alongside a women's march, at which point she reveals that she has in fact been running Fembot. Among other crimes, Monroe planned the murders of Irish Catholic doctors who refused to perform abortions, and politicians who denied asylum applications for lesbians and trans people. The play ends with Monroe's manifesto that the forces tolerating or even advocating violence against and oppression of women will be destroyed, and women will rebuild society. This liberatory ethos is echoed in the final lines of the play, in which Detective Utterson asks Hattie Jekyll why she's smiling when she's about to hang for the murder of the police officer, and she answers, "I'm free." One thing that should be apparent from these plot summaries is that Stevenson's novella and Placey's adaptation depict violence deployed for very different reasons. Stevenson's Hyde is simply evil, a claim made repeatedly, including by Jekyll himself. As Jekyll recounts in his written confession to Utterson, his friend and lawyer, "This familiar that I called out of my own soul and sent forth to do his good pleasure was a being inherently malign and villainous, his every act and thought centered on self, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another, relentless like a man of stone." In that quotation, I particularly want to draw your attention to the reference to Hyde's selfishness. Unlike Jekyll, who does engage extensively in charitable activities, Hyde is entirely without consideration of others. He functions primarily on what Sigmund Freud would later call the id, the selfish instincts that seek only the gratification of the subject's most basic desires. The id has no consideration of others or of society. And Stevenson reflects this when Jekyll recounts spontaneously changing into Hyde in a public park. "I began to be aware of a change in the temper of my thoughts, a greater boldness, a contempt of danger, a solution of the bonds of obligation." One of the defining distinctions between the ego and superego aligned Jekyll and the id-driven Hyde is that the former acknowledges social constraints while the latter does not feel bound by them. In terms of Hyde's actual violence in the novella, Stevenson narrates three principal instances: the trampling of a small child near the beginning, the murder of Sir Danvers Carew near the middle, and Hyde smacking a woman in the face for no apparent reason near the end of the book. In the early phases of the novella, Richard Enfield recounts to his relative and friend Utterson how he witnessed Hyde crash into and walk over a young woman late one night, leaving the poor girl injured and screaming. It's one of the most striking and memorable images of the book, and one that has frequently been incorporated into stage productions because of its visual impact. However, the most graphic description of Hyde's arbitrary violence comes with the murder of the much-beloved elderly MP, Sir Danvers. Based on the testimony of a maid who saw the attack from her top-floor window, Stevenson writes, "And then all of a sudden, Hyde broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. The old gentleman took a step back, with the air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt, and at that Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth, and next moment with ape-like fury he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows under which the bones were audibly shattered and the body jumped on the roadway." One of the most startling and disturbing elements of this brutal attack is how apparently unprovoked it is. Sir Danvers was merely chatting to Hyde, perhaps asking directions. There is no objective correlative, to borrow T.S. Eliot's famous term, for Hyde's violence here. Nothing about Sir Danvers' behavior gave Hyde any sort of external justification for the use of violence. Hyde simply wanted to kill, and so he did. By contrast, When Flossie Hyde and Florence Monroe use violence in Placey's adaptation, they do so with the at least ostensible goal of protecting women and LGBT people from systemic violence. Their use of violence serves to defend the community against violence or discrimination directed at its members. Flossie Hyde is in her usual tavern when Officer Michael Rose enters, ostensibly to arrest any prostitutes spreading venereal disease. As he enters, Rose makes clear he's only interested in harassing the women because he tells the male clientele, "Go take a piss or something." When Hyde challenges him, Rose dismisses all the other women on the premise of only arresting Hyde, but once they're alone, he attempts to extort sex from her, at which point, according to the stage directions, she stabs his neck with the hair fork, blood spurting everywhere. He's stumbling around, so she calmly stabs him again somewhere else, and then again. He falls to the floor onto his back. She stands over him. He's still breathing, barely, wheezing. This murder, the most visceral one staged in the play, contrasts sharply with the killing of Sir Danvers in Stevenson's version, because Rose is a member of the police force utilizing his official position in order to harass, arrest, and sexually extort the women of this tavern. For her part, Hyde insists that Rose let the other women leave first. If you're going to leave them be, I want to make sure a bunch of your buddies aren't going to come in here in a minute and arrest them. Let them go. Now, it would be hard to imagine Edward Hyde making such a demand on behalf of anybody else. And Flossie Hyde's attack on Rose is, while partly a gratification of her own violent impulses, clearly connected to this desire to protect the other women from police violence. Flossie Hyde's 21st century counterpart, Florence Monroe, similarly coordinates a campaign of violence against men and institutions that deny women rights, protection, and equality, if not actually enacting violence against them. As I said before, Flossie is arrested at the end of Act 1 for the murder of Michael Rose, and in Act 2 she's interrogated by the male Detective Chief Inspector Renford and the female Detective Constable Williams for various crimes carried out by the fembots, which follow the pattern of her blog-posted serial story about Flossie Hyde. During the interrogation, we learn the fembots have emasculated and murdered 4 Irish doctors, thrown 2 judges and an MP from buildings, and put bankers through plate glass windows. While still denying responsibility or involvement, Monroe analyzes the acts, explaining that the doctors denied women abortions, and therefore they've lost their own reproductive abilities. The judges and MPs, an MP had denied LGBT women asylum, resulting in them being executed in their home countries by being thrown from buildings. And the bankers were put through glass to symbolically break the glass ceiling. When Renford challenges her, "At least 9 people have just been killed, and you don't seem very upset," Monroe replies, "I'm not. Are you?" She looks at the camera. "I would never condone such acts, obviously, or do them myself, obviously. But I mean, now that they're done, I'm rather happy. It's pretty satisfying, don't you think? What do you think, D.C. Williams? How does it make you feel to know that those men are dead, that they can no longer do harm to another woman, that the people who represent the system meant to protect their health, protect their safety, which definitely didn't, those people now cease to exist, making a small chip in the fortress of those sexist systems? It feels just. It feels joyous. I feel really happy right now." Monroe's explanation is complicated and problematic, but the underlying logic of the fembot attacks, which again Monroe does later admit to organizing, is to protect women and LGBT people from violence and exploitation. The final line of Monroe's manifesto at the end of the play is, "And in the morning when the smoke has cleared, we women will build the city up again." For all the terroristic violence utilized to advance her cause, Monroe is responding to unfortunately common problems of violence and discrimination against women and LGBT people, for which they often find no redress through official, judicial, and political channels. Monroe herself does not plan to survive Fembot's coordinated attack on the city, so her motives are clearly not self-oriented. Instead, like Flossie Hyde, Monroe's violence protects a community of women and LGBT people by counteracting a system stacked against them. In a 5-star review for The Guardian, Gareth Lear Evans writes, "Retributive acts of extreme violence go unpunished. When change is too slow, things must be destroyed so that they can be built anew. The violence seems just and perfectly appropriate." And although Evans wonders whether such violence could only be indulged in the comparatively safe space of the theater, I think it is worth asking whether violence in Placey's play really does seem just and appropriate. To be clear, I'm not questioning whether defensive violence may sometimes be appropriate for community defense. It definitely can be. My concern with the violence Placey stages is twofold. First, whether there's a productive component to this violence, and second, whether the fembots specifically reflect a paranoid anti-feminist fantasy. I take these questions up in more detail in the full-length article, but basically, neither Hyde nor Monroe seems to have any developed plan for how their violence will lead to a more just future. Monroe does claim that we women will build the city up again, but nothing in the play suggests an actual plan for ensuring that rebuilding is more equitable. Additionally, one could argue that by embracing their own deaths, both Monroe and Hyde abdicate any responsibility for building a better society, settling merely for the violent act of destroying an unjust system. At the same time, I wonder whether Placey, a male playwright, let us not forget, has actually done feminism a good turn in staging the fembot terrorist group. The Me Too movement did receive significant pushback from conservatives and many prominent men. Pushback often playing into fantasies about feminazis and man-hating feminists trying to destroy all men. While the fembots are obviously fictional, Placey's vision of a ruthless feminist liberation army hews fairly close to the cultural boogeymen, or in this case boogie women, of the anti-feminist imaginary. And although anti-feminists obviously need very little justification to panic about feminist violence, it concerns me that a male playwright has envisioned a militant wing of the Me Too movement utilizing the tactics and rhetoric opponents of feminism rant about. Thank you.